April 13th, 1943. Station Hypo in Hawaii is buzzing with electronic ghosts. Code breakers are staring at a string of intercepted Japanese text. This is magic. The United States has broken the JN-25 naval code. One message stands out among the noise. It is a detailed flight plan for Admiral Yamamoto. He is the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. He is the most important military mind in the Japanese Empire. He is planning an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The schedule is precise to the very minute. Admiral Nimitz looks at the decoded transcript in Honolulu. He sees an opportunity that has never existed in the history of warfare. It is a chance to cut off the head of the Japanese Navy. But there is a massive technical problem. The target will be 400 miles away from the nearest American base. It is deep inside enemy territory. The mission requires a miracle of navigation and timing. This is the beginning of Operation Vengeance. The hunters are being fueled. The most daring air assassination in history is about to begin. The message was transmitted in the early morning hours of April 14th, 1943. It was sent using the Japanese naval code, known to the Americans as JN-25. The signal originated from the Japanese regional headquarters at Rabaul. It was addressed to the commanders of the North Solomon Islands. The text was dense with military abbreviations and coordinates. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, code breakers worked in a basement known as the dungeon. They utilized specialized IBM tabulating machines to process the intercepted radio waves. They were looking for magic, the term used for high-level decrypted intelligence. The analysts identified a specific header indicating an itinerary for a high-ranking official. As the letters began to form, a name emerged: Admiral Yamamoto. The message detailed a one-day inspection tour of the front lines. It listed the exact arrival and departure times for every stop on the schedule. Yamamoto was scheduled to leave Rabaul at 0600 on the morning of April 18th. He would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M, a twin-engine bomber known to the Allies as the Betty. The signal specified that his transport would be escorted by only 6 Mitsubishi A6M0s. The American codebreakers confirmed the authenticity of the signal within hours. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the briefing at his headquarters in Honolulu. He immediately understood the gravity of the decision before him. If the U.S. Navy intercepted the flight, it was a near certainty the Japanese would change their codes. Losing the ability to read JN-25 could set the Pacific War back by months or even years. However, Yamamoto was the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike. He was the charismatic center of the Japanese military's morale. American intelligence viewed him as the only Japanese leader with the vision to win the war. Nimitz consulted with his top staff and Admiral William Bull Halsey. They weighed the strategic value of the admiral's life against the secrecy of their intelligence source. The request for the mission was eventually sent all the way to the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox gave the final approval. The command issued to the field was direct: get Yamamoto. The mission was designated Operation Vengeance. The technical challenge was now handed to the pilots on the ground. Guadalcanal was the closest American base to the intercept point over Bougainville. But the distance was still 435 miles in a straight line. To avoid Japanese radar stations along the island chain, the pilots could not fly a direct path. They would have to swing wide into the open ocean, adding nearly 200 miles to the trip. The mission required an aircraft with extreme range and high-speed interception capability. The only plane in the world that fit this description was the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. The P-38G was a fork-tailed devil, powered by 2 Allison V1710 engines. Each engine generated 1,325 horsepower at high altitude. But the standard internal fuel tanks were sufficient for a 1,000-mile round trip. The 339th Fighter Squadron at Henderson Field needed a logistical miracle. They required specialized 310-gallon drop tanks to extend their reach. These massive external tanks had to be flown in from depots in the rear. They arrived at the muddy airfield under the cover of a tropical storm. Mechanics worked through the night to modify the fuel lines of 18 P-38Gs. Major John Mitchell was chosen to lead the mission. He was a master of dead reckoning navigation. He realized they would have to fly at wave-top level for the entire transit. Staying below 50 feet would keep them invisible to Japanese radar at Kahili and Buin. Mitchell began the grueling mathematical task of planning the intercept. He had to calculate the exact fuel burn of the Allison engines at low altitude. He had to account for the ground effect of the waves on his airspeed. He plotted 4 different legs for the journey to bypass enemy islands. If the P-38s were 2 minutes late, the Admiral would be under the protection of land-based guns. If they were 2 minutes early, they would be spotted by coastal lookouts. Mitchell synchronized his navigation board with the naval chronometer. He briefed his pilots in a tent while the rain hammered on the canvas. They were told they were hunting a high-ranking officer, but they didn't know it was Yamamoto. The squadron was divided into a killer group and a cover group. The killer group, led by Thomas Landfer and Rex Barber, was tasked with the actual shoot-down. The cover group would stay high to engage the Zero escorts. The pilots checked their survival gear and their .50 caliber ammunition belts. The P-38G was armed with 4 machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon in the nose. This concentrated fire was capable of shredding a bomber in a single pass. The flight was scheduled to launch at 07:25. They would be flying in total radio silence for over 2 hours. The plan was a masterpiece of technical coordination and raw nerve. The hunters were ready to ignite their engines. The ghost in the code was about to become a target in the sky. The intercept was more than a tactical strike. It was a strategic gamble that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Admiral Chester Nimitz held the decrypted flight plan in his hands at Pearl Harbor. He knew that killing Yamamoto could change the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. But Nimitz was a cautious man who understood the intelligence trap. If the Americans appeared too lucky, the Japanese would know their secrets were compromised. The U.S. Navy had been reading Japanese naval codes since the Battle of Midway. This advantage was the only thing keeping the smaller American fleet in the fight. Nimitz had to weigh the life of one admiral against the safety of thousands of future sailors. He contacted Admiral William Bull Halsey, the commander of the South Pacific. Halsey was known for his aggressive stance against the Japanese leadership. He immediately supported the mission, but deferred the final decision to Washington. The request for the assassination was transmitted via secure cable to the Secretary of the Navy. Frank Knox took the message directly to the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was briefed on the risks and the potential rewards. The American leadership viewed Yamamoto as the soul of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He was the man who had promised the Japanese people a decisive victory at Pearl Harbor. He was the only commander who had the respect of both the Army and the Navy. The White House authorized the strike under the strictest secrecy. The operation was given the official name, Operation Vengeance. The mission was then passed down to the operational commanders on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher was tasked with the logistical execution. He looked at the map of the Solomon Islands and realized the technical impossibility. The target was near the island of Bougainville. This was deep within the Japanese Empire of the Air. The Americans needed an aircraft that could fly 1,000 miles without landing. They also needed an aircraft that could survive a dogfight once it arrived. The Navy's F-4F Wildcats and F-4U Corsairs did not have the necessary range. Only one squadron in the region can handle the distance. This was the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 13th Air Force. They were equipped with the Lockheed P-38G Lightning. The P-38 was a strange-looking machine with a central pod and twin tail booms. It was faster and more heavily armed than almost anything in the Japanese inventory. But the 339th was exhausted from months of combat. Their planes were held together with spare parts and field modifications. The P-38G's engines were prone to intercooler issues in the tropical heat. If an engine failed over the open ocean, the pilot was a dead man. Mitcher called for Major John Mitchell to lead the mission. Mitchell was a calm, methodical pilot with a reputation for precision. He was told that a high-ranking officer would be in the air over Bougainville at 0935. He was not told the name of the target until much later. Mitchell began to calculate the fuel requirements. A standard P-38G carried 300 gallons of internal fuel. This was only enough for a 400-mile combat radius. To reach Bougainville and return, each plane would need to carry 2 external tanks. They needed one 165-gallon tank and one massive 310-gallon tank. The 310-gallon tanks were rare and had to be scavenged from across the Pacific. Some were even flown in from New Guinea on transport planes. The ground crews at Henderson Field worked through the night on April 17th. They utilized hand pumps to fill the massive drop tanks under the glare of flashlights. They checked the Allison V-1710 engines for any signs of oil leaks. The pilots were issued specialized long-range compasses for the journey. These were more accurate than the standard fighter compasses. Mitchell plotted a course that was a series of 4 distinct legs. He planned to stay 50 feet above the water to avoid detection. This low-level flying was incredibly taxing on the pilots. They would have to stare at the blue horizon for hours without a single landmark. Any error in navigation of even 1 degree would cause them to miss the island. The timing had to be perfect. If they arrived too early, the Japanese Zero patrols from Kahili would spot them. If they were late, Yamamoto's bomber would already be on the ground. The American pilots were briefed on the killer cover tactic. 4 pilots were designated as the killer group. Their only job was to ignore the Zeros and focus on the 2 Betty bombers. The remaining 14 pilots would stay at 18,000 feet to provide cover. Thomas Lanphier, Rex Barber, Joe McClanahan, and Besby Holmes were the killers. They checked their oxygen masks and their life vests. They knew that if they went down, there would be no rescue. The order was given for a dawn takeoff. The sun was about to rise on the most significant air ambush of the century. The engines of 18 Lightnings roared to life in the mud of Guadalcanal. The decision had been made. The hunt was officially on. The Lockheed P-38G Lightning was a radical departure from traditional fighter design. It was the first American fighter to feature a tricycle landing gear. It was easily identified by its unique twin-boom tail and central cockpit pod. For Operation Vengeance, the Lightning was not just a preference, it was a necessity. No other American fighter in 1943 possessed the range and speed required for the 1,000-mile round trip. The aircraft was powered by 2 Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled engines. These engines were equipped with General Electric turbo superchargers. This technology allowed the P-38 to maintain high horsepower in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. However, the mission to kill Yamamoto would be flown at sea level. At low altitudes, the Allison engines were fuel-hungry and prone to overheating. The pilots had to manage their manifold pressure with extreme care to avoid burning through their fuel. The P-38 was also the most heavily armed fighter in the Pacific theater. Unlike most fighters that had guns mounted in the wings, the P-38's weapons were in the nose. It carried 4 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns. In the center of the nose sat a single 20mm Hispano M1 cannon. Because the guns were concentrated in the nose, the pilot did not have to worry about convergence. The bullets traveled in a straight line from the aircraft's center. This made the P-38 a sniper of the sky. A pilot could hit a target from much farther away than a pilot in a Wildcat or a Corsair. The fork-tailed Devil was also incredibly stable during firing. The 2 engines rotated in opposite directions to cancel out the torque effect. This meant the aircraft didn't pull to one side when the pilot jammed the throttle forward. For a mission that required absolute precision, this stability was critical. The American pilots were also protected by the Hellcat's predecessor in ruggedness. The P-38 had heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat and a bulletproof windshield. It also featured self-sealing fuel tanks, a luxury the Japanese G4M Betty did not have. The Betty was so fragile that American pilots nicknamed it the one-shot lighter. The P-38's only major weakness was its size. It was a large aircraft with a wingspan of 52 feet. This made it a big target for the agile Japanese Zeros. The American tactical doctrine for the P-38 was to avoid turning dogfights. They used high-speed diving attacks and quick retreats. Major John Mitchell knew that the success of the mission depended on this speed. They had to strike before the Japanese escorts could react. The P-38Gs were also fitted with the latest radio equipment. However, they would be ordered to maintain radio silence for the entire journey. A single transmission would be picked up by Japanese listening posts on Choiseul Island. The pilots would have to communicate using hand signals alone. The cockpit of the P-38 was notoriously cramped and cold. For a 2-hour flight at 50 feet, the pilots would be drenched in sweat and deafened by the engine roar. But the machine was ready. The technical specifications of the Lightning had been pushed to their absolute limit. The final piece of the hardware puzzle was the fuel. They needed a way to make the Lightning stay in the air longer than it was ever designed to. This led to the 310-gallon solution. The mechanics were about to perform a field modification that would change history. The greatest obstacle to Operation Vengeance was not the Japanese Navy. It was the simple physics of fuel consumption. The distance from Henderson Field to the intercept point was nearly 450 miles. A direct flight would be a 900-mile round trip. But the Americans had to fly a circuitous route to stay hidden. This increased the total flight distance to roughly 1,000 miles. The internal fuel capacity of the P-38G was 300 gallons. This was enough for about 4 hours of flight under normal conditions. But a combat mission requires more than just cruising. The pilots needed extra fuel for high-speed maneuvering and the climb home. Major John Mitchell calculated that each plane needed at least 500 gallons to survive. The solution was the use of external drop tanks. These were aerodynamic fuel pods mounted on pylons under the wings. Standard P-38 missions used 165-gallon tanks. These were sufficient for most escort duties. But for the Yamamoto mission, even these were not enough. The mission required the rare and massive 310-gallon drop tanks. These tanks were over 10 feet long and shaped like cigars. They were heavy and difficult to handle on the muddy airfields of Guadalcanal. There was a severe shortage of these tanks in the Solomon Islands. The logistics team had to scavenge them from maintenance depots as far away as Australia and Fiji. They were rushed to Henderson Field by transport planes just hours before takeoff. The ground crews worked under the humid tropical night. They used manual hand pumps to fill the tanks with high-octane aviation gasoline. Each plane was fitted with one 310-gallon tank and one 165-gallon tank. This asymmetrical load made the aircraft difficult to fly. The extra weight shifted the center of gravity and increased the drag significantly. The P-38 would be sluggish and slow during the transit. The pilots were instructed to fly on the external tanks first. This ensured that if they were jumped by enemy fighters early, they could drop the extra weight. They would then have full internal tanks for the dogfight. The fuel management system inside the P-38 was complex. The pilot had to manually operate a series of valves to switch between tanks. If the timing was wrong, the engines could starve of fuel and stall. This was a dangerous maneuver while flying over 50 feet above the ocean. A stalled engine at that altitude meant an instant crash into the sea. The mechanics also had to modify the plumbing for the 310-gallon tanks. The standard P-38G fuel lines were not designed for such a high flow rate from external pods. They used field kits to reinforce the seals and prevent leaks. A fuel leak in the tropical heat was a recipe for a mid-air explosion. The pilots also had to deal with the intercooler problem. The P-38 used air-to-air intercoolers to keep the turbocharged air cool. At sea level, the air is thick and hot. The intercoolers were working at their absolute limit to prevent engine knock. The fuel mixture had to be set to auto-rich to help cool the cylinders. This increased the fuel burn even further. Mitchell and his team spent the final hours before the mission double-checking the math. They factored in the weight of the ammunition and the pilots. They calculated the fuel burn for every 15 minutes of the journey. The 310-gallon tanks were the only reason the mission was possible. Without them, the killer group would have run out of gas before seeing the enemy. The P-38s were now loaded to their maximum takeoff weight. They were fueled to the brink. But having the fuel was only half of the challenge. The next step was the impossible math of navigation. The pilots were about to fly into a blind void for 2 hours. Major John Mitchell sat in a flickering tent on the edge of Henderson Field. He was the leader of the 339th Fighter Squadron. He was also a master of dead reckoning navigation. This is the process of calculating one's current position by using a previously determined position. It requires an obsessive attention to speed, time, and compass heading. For Operation Vengeance, the math was nearly impossible. Mitchell had to guide 18 aircraft over 600 miles of featureless ocean. They could not use radio navigation or radar. A single radio ping would give their position away to Japanese listening stations. The Japanese had powerful radar units at Kahili and Vila. To remain invisible, the Americans had to stay below the radar horizon. This meant flying the entire distance at an altitude of exactly 50 feet. At this height, the pilots could see the salt spray on their windshields, but they could not see the horizon clearly. Mitchell had to account for the Coriolis effect and wind drift. A crosswind of even 5 knots would push the squadron miles off course over a 2-hour period. He broke the flight into 4 distinct legs to bypass the enemy islands. The first leg took them far out into the Coral Sea. The second leg turned them north toward the Treasury Islands. The third leg aimed them directly at the coast of Bougainville. The fourth and final leg was the intercept run. Mitchell used a Jeppesen slide rule to calculate his fuel-to-weight ratio. He knew that as the external tanks emptied, the planes would become lighter and faster. He had to adjust his throttle settings every 15 minutes to maintain a constant speed. The speed was the most critical variable. He had calculated that the Japanese G4M Betty would be cruising at 180 knots. If the P-38s arrived at the intercept point at 210 knots, they would meet exactly at 0935. If Mitchell was off by just 1% in his speed, they would miss Yamamoto by miles. He also had to account for the magnetic variation of the Solomon Islands. The iron-rich volcanic soil of the islands could pull a compass needle several degrees off-center. Mitchell relied on his Navy Mark 8 drift sight to check the movement of the waves. By watching the whitecaps, he could estimate the wind speed and direction. He taped a small, hand-drawn chart to his right thigh. It contained the headings and the exact number of minutes for each leg. 2 hours and 9 minutes, he muttered to his flight leaders. That was the total transit time to the kill zone. The pilots were forbidden from speaking during the flight. They would have to trust Mitchell's navigation with their lives. If he led them into a blind patch of ocean, they would all run out of fuel and disappear. Mitchell also had to factor in the sun's position. He planned the final turn so the P-38s would have the sun at their backs. This would make them invisible to the Japanese tail gunners until it was too late. The complexity of the plan was staggering for the 1940s. They were attempting a precision strike with 18 planes using only stopwatches and compasses. It was an analog solution to a digital problem. The ground crews finished the final inspections of the Allison engines. Mitchell climbed into his cockpit and checked his Hamilton flight watch. He looked at the long line of P-38s shimmering in the humid morning heat. They were loaded with 500 gallons of fuel and 2,000 rounds of ammunition each. Every pilot knew the math was thin. Every pilot knew the margin for error was 0. Mitchell signaled for the engines to start. The twin-boomed Hunters began to taxi through the mud. The impossible math was about to be tested against the reality of the Pacific sky. The 18 P-38 Lightnings roared off the metal-planked runway of Henderson Field. The time was exactly 07:25. As the wheels retracted into the twin booms, a heavy, oppressive silence settled over the squadron. Major John Mitchell led the formation toward the open sea. This was the beginning of 2 hours of absolute radio silence. Any transmission, however brief, could be detected by the Japanese electronic intelligence units. The Japanese had powerful radio direction finders located on the high peaks of the Choiseul Island. The American pilots were ordered to keep their microphones cold. They dropped to an altitude of only 30 feet above the cresting waves. At this height, the salt spray from the Pacific Ocean coated their windshields. The pilots had to use their mechanical wipers to maintain any semblance of visibility. Flying so low was a grueling test of physical and mental endurance. The ground effect provided a small cushion of air under the wings, but it also meant that a single lapse in concentration would result in a fatal collision with the water. The heat in the cramped cockpits was nearly unbearable. The sun beat down through the plexiglass canopies, turning the flight decks into ovens. Because they were at low altitude, the air was thick, humid, and turbulent. The pilots were drenched in sweat within the first 20 minutes. They could not talk to their wingmen to relieve the tension. They could only communicate using a series of predetermined hand signals. A thumb pointed down meant it was time to switch fuel tanks. A wagging of the wings indicated a change in heading. McClanahan and Moore, two of the Killer Group pilots, watched their fuel gauges with obsession. They were flying on their massive 310-gallon external tanks. These tanks created a significant amount of drag and yaw. The pilots had to constantly fight the controls to keep the heavy aircraft level. Mitchell checked his Hamilton chronometer every minute. He compared his stopwatch to the landmarks of the passing waves. He was looking for the subtle changes in watercolor that indicated submerged reefs. These reefs served as his only milestones in the featureless blue void. The squadron crossed the first leg of the journey without incident. They were now deep into the Japanese-controlled Solomon Sea. The tension increased as they neared the Treasury Islands. This was a known patrol area for Japanese Zeros based at Kahili. Every pilot's head was on a swivel, scanning the sky for the glint of an enemy wing. They saw nothing but the endless horizon and the white foam of the Pacific. The P-38Gs were humming with a mechanical perfection that was rare in the tropics. The Allison V-1710 engines were holding their manifold pressure steady. Mitchell adjusted his heading by 5 degrees to account for a shifting crosswind. The impossible math was being translated into reality. As they reached the 100-minute mark, the pilots began their final fuel preparations. They reached down and turned the heavy brass fuel selector valves. They switched from the nearly empty external tanks to their internal wing tanks. This was the most dangerous moment of the transit. If the engine coughed or vapor-locked at 30 feet, the pilot had no room to recover. One by one, the 18 Lightnings maintained their steady roar. They were now lighter and more agile for the combat to come. The coast of Bougainville began to shimmer through the heat haze in the distance. Mitchell looked at his watch. They were exactly on schedule. The silence was about to be broken by the sound of 20-millimeter cannons. The forked-tailed devils had arrived at the back door of the Japanese Empire. The ambush was ready to spring. The coast of Bougainville rose from the sea like a dark, jagged spine. Major John Mitchell looked at his Hamilton watch and then at the horizon. The time was exactly 09:34. He had led his squadron through 600 miles of silence and salt spray. He looked up and to the right, toward the high peaks of the island. Two dark specks emerged from the tropical haze. They were Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, flying in a loose V formation. Behind them and slightly above, 6 Mitsubishi A6M-0s provided a close escort. The Japanese were exactly where the magic intercept said they would be. Mitchell had achieved a miracle of navigation. He signaled the killer group by wagging his wings and pointing toward the targets. Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber immediately dropped their external fuel tanks. The heavy 310-gallon pods fell into the sea, instantly making the P-38s lighter. The American pilots slammed their throttles forward into war emergency power. The Allison engines screamed as the turbochargers kicked in. The P-38s began a steep, high-speed climb to intercept the bombers at 2,000 feet. The Japanese escort pilots were caught completely off guard. They were looking for high-altitude bombers, not twin-engine fighters rising from the waves. Rex Barber was the first to close the distance on the lead Betty bomber. He centered his Mark 8 reflector sight on the bomber's right engine. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a stream of 20mm and 50 caliber rounds. The Betty, known as the one-shot lighter, had no armor or self-sealing tanks. The right wing of the bomber erupted in a bright magnesium-fueled flame. The aircraft began to shed pieces of aluminum skin as it spiraled toward the jungle. Inside the aircraft, Admiral Yamamoto was strapped into his seat. The bomber slammed into the dense canopy of the Bougainville rainforest. A massive plume of black smoke rose into the humid air. The second Betty bomber tried to dive toward the safety of the sea. Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine chased it down, stitching the fuselage with fire. It crashed into the water near the coastline, leaving no survivors. In less than 3 minutes, the head of the Japanese Navy had been severed. The 6 Zeros finally reacted, diving in a frantic attempt to avenge their commanders. But the P-38s of the cover group were already diving from 18,000 feet. A chaotic dogfight broke out over the burning jungle. Mitchell kept his eyes on the clock. They had less than 5 minutes of combat fuel left. He signaled for the squadron to break contact and head for the open sea. One American P-38, piloted by Raymond Hine, was lost in the engagement. The remaining 17 Lightnings turned their noses toward Guadalcanal. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and flying into history. The Forked-tailed Devils had completed the most significant air assassination of the war. Operation Vengeance was a masterpiece of technical intelligence and pilot grit. The death of Yamamoto was a blow from which the Japanese Imperial Navy never recovered. It shattered the morale of the Japanese leadership and the public alike. The Americans had used the magic of code breaking to win a battle before it even began. The P-38 Lightning had proven itself as the ultimate long-range weapon of the Pacific. Decades of controversy followed regarding which pilot actually fired the fatal shot. But the technical reality remains. 18 men and 1,000 miles of ocean changed the war. The farm boys and city kids in the cockpits had outcalculated the empire. They proved that in modern warfare, the strongest weapon is often the one the enemy cannot see. The hunt was over, and the tide of the Pacific had turned for good. If you want to see more deep dives into the secret missions of World War II, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a technical breakdown. Comment below. Do you think the U.S. should have risked their code-breaking secret for this one kill? Thanks for watching.